Right. So here we are with Terence George Vesey on his 80th birthday in April 2014, and you were born in 1934. So, Terry, tell us about your childhood, what your parents and your grandparents did, what you remember about your family history.
Well, I was born in a place called Silvertown, which is near Canning Town, and we lived there until I was nearly 6 when the war broke out. Mother and father, and of course families lived fairly close together in those days. So Granny Kenny, my mum's single name was Kenny, Granny Kenny lived just along the road, so we were a fairly close family unit. I didn't really sort of have many meetings with my grandfather on my father's side until after the war, but the sort of general background was one of an East End family. My father worked in the London docks, and my mother looked after 4 children. There was 3 girls, Joyce, Iris and Doreen, and myself. And then later on during the war, my brother Brian was born in the 1940s, 1943, 44, so he's 10 years younger than me, and he was a wartime baby. That's about the sort of early remembrances. I can remember one childhood incident. You were asking about early childhood things, and I can remember we had a huge factory not far from us down the road called the Paragon, and they used to produce stationery and books, and it was massive, certainly to a child. And I can remember riding a little tiny tricycle along the pavement and looking up at these walls, and I must have been maybe 4 to 5 years old. That's probably one of my earliest childhood memories.
So you say your father worked in the docks, and your mum. What do you remember about them as people?
Well, Dad was a very quiet person. He didn't say a lot. He was a very stoic sort of bloke. He went off to work and did his job and came home. I have more memories of him later on in life when I came back from Somerset, having been evacuated. We were all evacuated in 1939 when war broke out, and we went to Oxford first of all, and were billeted out there for a short period, for nearly a year, and then my mother went to Somerset and had a cottage in a place called Evercreech, or in actual fact Stony Stratton, which is a hamlet a mile or so away, and I lived there from the age of 6 to 11 till the end of the war, when we returned to London. Very good years for a lad, really. We didn't realise the war was on, and I worked on the local farm during the school summer holidays, and in fact one of my early memories is working for a farmer Doble, and after the first week making hay, etc., and helping with the mangles and all the other ancillary jobs around the farm, we were asked to come to see him on a Friday night to get our wages, and there were 3 of us, and the farmer Doble came out of his kitchen and we lined up and put our hands out, and he put a ½ crown in each of our hands, which we looked at in quite astonishment, and then he said, "Don't go away, boys," and then he got out his wallet and he gave us each a 10-shilling note. So we had 12 and 6pence for the week's work, which was ½ crown a day. So we ran all the way home feeling well, like millionaires really. Our first ever pay packet.
And I mean, as you say, your father was in the docks, and your mum basically brought up your family.
Yeah.
So, how would you say your income was? Would you say you were working class, or?
Oh yeah, we weren't uh, we weren't moneyed in any way whatsoever. Father was obviously at some stage unemployed and only working on odd days when the docks board or whoever was responsible for taking the labourers on gave them work, and sometimes it was only for a week or a few days, and I think times were fairly hard. After the war, I think it improved quite a bit. There was quite a lot of work in the London docks, as opposed to pre-war when my parents weren't very well off, and I think they had some very hard times. And we heard stories from Granny Kenny, who used to say that my mother went and borrowed a shilling from her to go and buy some meat bones so that she could make a stew. So times were pretty hard, but I never noticed as a child ever being hungry really, and certainly during the war, when rationing was on us, as we lived in the country, we had a fair amount of extras, I think, in the way of rabbit, and my father grew vegetables in the garden, so we had a fair amount of vegetables coming in, and things like eggs, which were available from the farm. So we did all right, I think, overall. Probably our parents went a bit hungry from time to time, but we didn't seem to suffer. And there was plenty of apples to scrump, so we had blackberries, etc.
So was your grandfather docker as well? And is the Vesey family going back in the docks for many generations then?
Yeah, Grandad was a dock worker. I knew him, I recollect Grandad when I was about 11, really, after the war, and because he was getting older then, and he lived till he was 81, Grandad, and he was a big man, over 6 foot tall, and quite a strong, determined character. And because my father, he lost his mother when he was about 12 years old. So although Grandad remarried, Dad had a stepbrother called Fred Halfpenny. It wasn't worth a lot, was it? But but that I never met him, but Father talked about him occasionally. But on Grandad's side, as I say, he must have had a fairly hard time, because as a youngster with his mother dead, he was responsible really for doing quite a lot of the work around the house. So I think he had a fairly hard time. Yeah.
And how did you then avoid going into the docks? How comes you didn't end up a docker as well?
Well, when I went, having passed one of the scholarships, I went to part of West Ham Municipal College, and they decided that as I wasn't brilliant academically, I went into the building side of it, and I was training to be either a carpenter or a painter and decorator or a plumber, and there was a building craft as well. But some of the more academic types did very well, because they carried on with day school and night school and ended up as architects and surveyors and things like that. But during the course of my school days, as it were, I became a sea cadet, and one of the officers, who was the commanding officer, Lieutenant Farrow, he asked me if I would be willing to work in his West End office. He was an editor in a publishing company, Thomas Skinner and Company, who used to publish the ABC Railway Guide and the Directory of Directors, Banker's Almanac and Yearbook. And as a youngster, I worked on the Banker's Almanac and Yearbook and the Directory of Directors, more or less as an office boy to start with. And then when I was about to leave school, or should have stayed on really, I had a decision to make. And as I was offered a job in the editor's office, I decided that I wouldn't continue with my schoolwork, and I left and became a junior clerk in this publishing office, and I stayed there for a couple of years until I was due to be called up for national service. So that was a break from what I was training for, and I became set in my sedentary job as a clerk really. But fate took over, and from then on, because I stayed on my office chair for the rest of my life.
Well, you did some years in the Navy, didn't you, on your national service?
Yeah, I was called. Well, I joined the RNVR, which is Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, from the Sea Cadets. I used to go to the embankment, HMS President, which was moored on the embankment, and I used to do one night a week for 2 or 3 hours there. And when it came to going into the forces, most of the lads of my age were conscripted into the army, possibly the Air Force, but you didn't really have a lot of choice. But as I'd been a Sea Cadet and RNVR, I was allowed to go into the Navy, which I joined as a stores assistant, and we had a badge on our arm which said SAS, Stores Assistant Stores, but I think we used to tell the young ladies that we were members of the Special Squadron SAS, so it was a bit of a swanky thing to do.
And I mean, just coming back to growing up again, I presume you didn't have any telephones? Did you have electricity and indoor bathrooms and things like that? Or?
No, in our early flat we certainly didn't have a bathroom, and the loo was down the stairs in the garden, down the back stairs. After the war, when Mum got her flat, we came back from Evercreech. We had a flat which was first floor, you know, not the ground floor, and we didn't have a bathroom there, so that was very difficult. Didn't have hot water or central heating, and I think my mother paid a special price for somebody to come and rig up a little bit of electricity, so we had electric light in the main dining room, kitchen and front room, but the other rooms we had candles or gas lighting on the old-fashioned mantles, and you used to put money in the slot in the meter for the gas. So that was a bit of a crude sort of way of going on. If you shook the mantle, it disintegrated because it was made of a very light fabric. So I don't suppose anyone's ever seen one of these in the last 20 or 30 years or more.
Was it coal fires? Each room had a coal fire then?
Well, yeah, we had a coal fire in the dining room, and if you sat round it, you got warm, and if you were 2 chairs away from it, you shivered. So it wasn't a very warm way of living. We're all spoiled a bit now with our central heating.
And did you have carpets on the floors, or?
No, I think we might have had a mat, but it was very very ordinary. Mum was a good housekeeper and kept everything spotlessly clean, but didn't have much money, so you didn't have many luxuries. After the war, I can remember having a radio which was rented from a company called Radio Rentals, and I think that was probably 2 or 3 shillings a week to rent a radio, and then a few years later we rented a television, one of the early black and white sets. Can't remember what the charge was for that, but that was always quite an exciting thing, really, to see, say, a cup final or something on.
What year would that have been, do you think, then?
That would have probably been 1949, 50, and I think most people were sort of still recovering from the war. It was only 4 or 5 years after the war, but things were improving a bit, and I think there were certain things still in existence, and I think even in the 50s bread was still rationed, or it was rationed for a period of time, and it took some years to get back to normal situation with food, and of course people weren't very well off anyway, so they lived on a very restricted diet, I think, and although the butcher was still available for probably the price of 12 and sixpence old money, you could buy a joint of lamb, which I think was my father and my mother's favourite, certainly on the weekend, on the Sunday.
And did everybody sort of travel using trams and things? Did anybody have a car? Did you know anybody that had a car?
No, I think until I came out of the Navy when I was 20, nearly getting on 20 and a half, I think I bought an old Morris 8, cost £65, and I think there were only 2 cars in the street. My old friend from school days, Albert, who lived 100 yards away, had an old car, and I had an old car. And apart from that, you went up to the main road and got on a trolley bus. Trams had gone by then, but trolley buses were the thing in those days, and they whipped along quite well. And I know when I started my office job, I used to go from the Abbey Arms to Aldgate bus station, near Aldgate tube station, and it used to cost me 4 pence, 4D, old money, for a journey that took, half an hour. So I suppose it was quite good value. Yeah.
So moving on then from, you say you left the Navy and then you went into, did you join Johnny Walker at that early stage?
Well, what I'd done, or did rather, just before I was called up for the Navy, I'd had a couple of years with the publishers, and I decided, I had a friend working for Johnny Walker Whisky at Aldgate, and he was getting more money than I was. So he suggested that I try Johnny Walker's and see if they had any opportunities. So I phoned up and they asked me to go along for an interview, and I was interviewed by, funny enough, 3 people: the manager, the assistant manager, and the pay clerk, a chap called Len Cottage, who was responsible for the wages for 350 people in the factory. And they asked me if I had any skills in figure work, and I said, well, I'd been dealing with balance sheets, assets and liabilities, and various figures for the publication, the Banker's Almanac and Yearbook. And although I wasn't a brilliant mathematician, I had basic knowledge of figures and things like that. So they said, oh, we'll take you on trial. And I started with Johnny Walker's and worked with them for approximately a year, I think it was, before I went in the Navy, during which time the manager used to write to me at Christmas and send me a bottle of whiskey and said, would I consider coming back to the company when my 2 years was up? I said I wasn't sure what to do, but he said, well, come back and try it, even if it's only for a short period,